Welcome back everyone, I'm Nick930, and to celebrate the upcoming release of Crysis Remastered, I wanted to share with you the complete history of Crysis. Crysis is a science fiction video game series created by a German game development studio called Crytek back in the late 2000s. The series is best known for its achievements in graphical technology, with visual effects that rival even some of the best looking games today. Though, while its visual prowess is certainly one of its most recognizable features, Crysis was always something more. A series not afraid to challenge players with the freedom to approach first-person combat their own way, with sprawling sandbox environments and powerful abilities to help make the most of the game's many features. Crytek, the creators of the game, typically avoid creating direct sequels to their properties, but Crysis proved to be one series that they could never step away from. And now, nearly 7 years after the last game in the series released, Crytek is revisiting the series once again, only this time to revitalize the one that started it all. So how did we get to this point? And why did the series disappear for so long in the first place? Well, to answer that, let's take it all the way back to the origins of Crytek itself. In the late 1990s, a German game designer by the name of Cevat Yurli established an unofficial game studio called Crytek, and invited several other talented programmers that he had met online to work with him. The studio quickly grew, with each member contributing their own expertise to help form the backbone of what would later become the studio's proprietary game engine architecture. In '99, Yurli and his two brothers traveled to the Electronic Entertainment Expo in Los Angeles in hopes of finding someone interested in their work. The demo he brought with him was called Exile, and featured a large tropical island populated with dinosaurs and dense vegetation. It was unlike anything the industry had seen before, with an advanced bump mapping technique, along with real-time reflections, especially along the surface of the water. After the presentation, Cevat was approached by Nvidia with an opportunity to package their Exile tech demo with the upcoming GeForce 3 graphics cards, a deal that would help put the up-and-coming game studio on the map. Throughout the course of the next year, they released several updates to the demo, unlocking additional functionality and improved visual capabilities. As the demo made the rounds, Ubisoft took interest and offered to publish a full game based on their technical showcase. Cevat, eager to publish his first game, agreed, and the studio began to reimagine their graphical architecture. Early concepts for the game involved fighting dinosaurs that had been resurrected by an ancient alien force. But as the studio refined their AI, they opted to instead populate their tropical island with human enemies, introducing a more grounded action experience. Finally, in 2004, Crytek released their first official game, Far Cry. Far Cry was different from other shooters at the time, as it strongly encouraged a more careful approach to encounters with enemies. Players could always try and go in guns blazing, but the advanced AI and deadly weapons make a direct frontal approach nearly impossible in most situations. Instead, players are encouraged to take advantage of the dense jungles and extreme draw distances to outsmart their opponents, making the game world less of a background and more of a direct factor in the shooting action. Far Cry was met with a positive reception, with many praising the game's beautiful graphical design, smart AI, and open-ended approach to gameplay. However, it was also met with plenty of criticism, including complaints about the difficulty, the subpar story delivery, and the mutant monkey-filled final act. But rather than addressing these issues with a direct sequel, Crytek decided against continuing the series. The studio wanted to continue to innovate, and were afraid of getting stuck working on a single property, so they abandoned the Far Cry IP and sought out their next major publisher. Only a few months after Far Cry's release, Electronic Arts officially announced a partnership with Crytek, providing the growing German game studio with everything they needed to expand and bring out the most technologically advanced video game of all time. With the funding secured, Yurli asked his art team to create images based on his vision, a tropical paradise occupied by a massive alien dome that had frozen everything within its boundaries. The artist returned with exactly what Yurli had asked for, locking in the concept and driving the process forward. The system engineering team immediately began to overhaul the graphical architecture, adding in more complex shader techniques, improving the artificial intelligence, and incorporating new effects like advanced volumetric lighting, motion blur, and realistic water simulation. Additionally, they revamped their advanced physics system, allowing for an unprecedented amount of player interaction. Meanwhile, the creative team behind the game brainstormed how they could incorporate their advanced graphical engine into an enjoyable gameplay experience. They started by incorporating all the aspects of Far Cry 1 that worked, like the open-ended level designs and the guerrilla warfare, but decided to enhance it further with a more forgiving health system and more professional narrative approach. In order to create the most authentic jungle environments possible, they sent a research team out to Tahiti to photograph various types of flora and architecture, most of which was recreated entirely to be used as assets for the game's many island-themed environments. To help nail the cinematic feel of the gameplay, they hired Blur Studio to create a high-quality cinematic reel that the development team then worked to replicate using their own game engine. Finally, at E3 2006, Crytek presented a cinematic demo reel of the new CryEngine 2 in action. Volumetric clouds, real-time lighting, enhanced shadows, and various post-processing effects like motion blur and depth of field all blended together along with the beautiful photorealistic jungles, painting a digital scene unlike anything ever seen before. And at the end of it, an official reveal of the game's title, Crysis. The response was hugely positive, with many in disbelief of just how real it all looked. Games had incorporated things like realistic physics before, but not to this degree, and the lighting effects and other cinematic features far surpassed other titles shown on the same stage floor. Not since Half-Life 2 and Doom 3 had gamers seen such a monumental leap forward in graphical technology, and fans were eager to get their hands on the final game. With anticipation mounting, lead designer Bernd Damer decided that the final year of development would require an increased focus on improving the actual gameplay experience. Early drafts of the game saw players controlling a standard Spec Ops soldier alongside his squad, taking down groups of enemies and upgrading their armor with pieces found throughout the environment. It was interesting, and made it easy to provide beautiful scripted sequences to show off the graphics, but they eventually decided against it, finding that players were not given enough freedom. They also found that the armor system and customization slowed the pacing of the gameplay too much, and several of the same problems that they faced with the original Far Cry reared their head, like overly powerful enemies that made the player feel weak and defenseless. To rectify the problem, the team decided to redesign the standard health design in favor of a system like Bungie's Halo, with a secondary shield that would recharge when not taking fire. From here, the team discovered that they could add more abilities to the player's arsenal to help make the game even more fun, like increased speed or increased strength. After locking down the set of core abilities, the level designers then tweaked each level environment, providing long lanes to sprint through and plenty of cover to move between while cloaked. The process took months to accomplish, and with the release date right around the corner, the team was ultimately forced to phone in the final stages, cutting out planned open-ended gameplay in favor of a more scripted cinematic finale. Finally, after years of development, Crytek released an extensive demo for their game, allowing players to play through the entire first level. But as excited PC gamers booted up the EXE and cranked up all the graphic settings, they were greeted with a disappointing realization: the game was extremely demanding. PC gamers everywhere searched for solutions, even resorting to upgrading their hardware thanks to clever Crysis-based adverts encouraging higher-end video cards, inevitably resulting in the iconic phrase, "Can it run Crysis?" as players sought to crank up the game's visuals as high as possible and showboat that they had achieved even a few frames more. But as gamers managed to lock down an acceptable performance level, they soon discovered that Crysis offered something more than just expensive eye candy. Finally, on November 13th, 2007, Crytek unleashed Crysis onto the world, exclusively for the PC platform. Crysis takes place on a fictional archipelago called the Lingshan Islands, and centers on a conflict between American Special Forces, North Korean militants, and a long-dormant alien species. The game kicks off with a desperate distress call made by a researcher named Helena Rosenthal, who explains that the North Koreans have taken over the island and are at risk of getting their hands on something their team had managed to uncover. The player assumes the role of an American Delta Force soldier named Nomad, who is sent to the island to rescue Helena and clear the way for an American ground assault against the KPA. Nomad doesn't offer much of a personality. He simply follows orders and serves as a vehicle for the story to be delivered. His fellow Raptor team members, though, offer a bit more character. There's the group's leader, Prophet, who sets up the general mission objectives and provides the player with frequent radio updates, Jester, who's got a bit of a sarcastic edge to his quips, and of course, the loudmouth former SAS member, Michael Sykes, aka Psycho, whose gung-ho attitude frequently clashes with Prophet's instructions. Armed with limited information and their super advanced nanosuits, Raptor Team are deployed onto the island, but within seconds are picked apart by a mysterious alien threat lurking in the jungles, leaving the character alone to contend with the island's dangerous inhabitants. Crysis' general plot structure shares a lot of the same narrative threads established with Far Cry. A lone soldier, stranded on a tropical island with an overwhelming military presence, forced to fight his way through established camps and ruined structures only to find something more sinister at the heart of it all. The Lingshan Islands play host to a powerful alien race, who have begun to awaken from their hibernation within the island's central peak. Crysis also delivers a more cinematic presentation than its predecessor. Cutscenes, for example, are incorporated more frequently throughout the campaign, and help to re-establish key character personalities, all captured realistically thanks to the game's advanced shader system and animation design. Crysis' story, while not necessarily the most memorable thing to come out of the world of gaming in 2007, marked a major improvement for the team at Crytek, and works hand in hand with the highly immersive new gameplay direction. At first glance, Crysis looks and plays like any other first-person shooter, but the incorporation of the nanosuit helps to give Crysis its own unique style. Right from the start, players have access to every suit function. There's Maximum Armor, that serves as the suit's default mode and minimizes damage received from incoming gunfire. Maximum Strength, that reinforces the user's muscle fibers, allowing them to jump extremely high or throw heavy objects with increased force. Maximum Speed, that allows the user to sprint at insanely fast speeds and clear huge gaps. And then there's Cloak, that turns the user partially invisible, useful for bypassing enemy patrols or repositioning safely during combat. To balance these powerful abilities, the nanosuit has a blue energy bar that requires a recharge after excessive use. This means you can't stay in cloaked mode forever, or sprint at super speed across the entire island. Instead, players need to carefully plan their actions, and can swap between different suit functions using a handy comma rows interface. This interface also includes a fifth option, the weapon customization menu, which allows players to modify any weapon they're holding with found attachments, including scopes, suppressors, flashlights, laser sights, and underbarrel launchers, all without pausing the action. The large combination of weapon attachments help to make the disappointingly small arsenal of firearms more interesting. Weapons include the Superior Combat Assault Rifle, aka the SCAR, the North Koreans' FY-71, pistols that can be dual-wielded, a pump-action shotgun, an SMG, and a long-range sniper rifle. As players start to face off against more powerful enemies, more powerful weapons can be found, like the experimental Gauss cannon, the handheld minigun, and the rocket launcher that can fire 3 guided rockets, perfect for dealing with enemy armor units and helicopters. Unlike Far Cry, the player is now limited to only holding 2 primary weapons, encouraging players to plan out their actions more carefully. Players can, for example, pick enemies off silently using a combination of the nanosuit's cloak ability and weapon suppressors, or grab an assault rifle and throw caution to the wind, shooting everyone while jumping across rooftops and blowing up massive fuel depots. Naturally, this high level of customization pairs perfectly with the dense jungle environments on the island. Players can venture across gorgeous tropical beaches and sprawling valleys, often broken up by heavily fortified military camps, along with the mammoth alien structure at the core of it all. And while these locations are certainly visually interesting, they also play a crucial role in how the player tackles objectives. Crysis' level structure are designed to take full advantage of the player's nanosuit, while also encouraging the use of creative physics-based alternatives. You can throw barrels, crash vehicles into buildings, or rip apart trees with sustained gunfire. The game constantly encourages exploiting its many physics-based tools, providing an experience that feels more experimental than intentional. To help traverse these wide-reaching levels, Crysis also lets players pilot several different types of vehicles, including trucks, boats, heavy armor, and even a VTOL at one point. Then of course, there's the opposition. The enemies start off fairly straightforward, with human soldiers equipped with handguns and rifles patrolling the area and popping off flares to request reinforcements. But they scale upwards rather quickly. Fortifications begin to feature mounted machine guns and sniper towers, and are even surrounded by landmines, requiring the player to make use of all their suit's capabilities and acquired weapons to come out on top. Some soldiers are even equipped with knockoff nanosuits, capable of turning them invisible or wielding powerful miniguns. The game takes an even more drastic turn about halfway through, after the player enters the heart of the central alien structure. The island becomes consumed by a frozen energy sphere, and the action flips entirely into direct confrontations with different types of flying blue aliens. It's arguably one of the weakest aspects of the game, despite its very interesting premise, and is hurt further by the increased demand on hardware and the more linear nature of the final few missions. But still, even when considering the slight misstep in the final act, Crysis' campaign provides an enjoyable demonstration of what CryEngine 2 is capable of, while also incorporating some solid shooting mechanics and the freedom to approach the gameplay in an endless number of ways. And then of course, there's the online competitive multiplayer, that takes all the aspects fans loved about the campaign and applies it to a competitive space. Players can choose to play as either the US or the North Koreans, both of which are equipped with equally powerful nanosuits, and fight for control over decently sized island-based environments. There's only two modes: instant action, that serves as a simple free-for-all deathmatch, and the much more popular power struggle, that sees two teams fight for control points in an effort to destroy the enemy's main base of operations. Much like Counter-Strike, players can earn points for killing enemies and spend those points at captured outposts to equip more powerful gear, including weapons, gadgets, and even vehicles. This mode offers large-scale 32-player multiplayer combat, in the same vein as Battlefield and the Enemy Territory games, only with super-powered nanosuits and mini-nukes added in to help make it feel unique. Like many multiplayer games from this time, the service has been permanently shut down with the closure of GameSpy, requiring longtime fans to install community-made modifications in order to access this part of the game. Crysis also paired with its release a robust editing tool called Sandbox 2 that allows users to create their own level designs and enemy configurations for hours of additional gameplay, a decision that was likely made to gauge interest in licensing out their architecture in the future. Crysis was met with an overwhelmingly positive response from audiences. It was praised for its beautiful technological achievements, along with its immersive gameplay mechanics and smart level design. However, it also acquired a reputation for having poor optimization, as nobody could run the game at the highest graphical settings without compromising the performance significantly. Though the game was never really designed to run perfectly on hardware back in 2007. Crytek specifically built the game to scale upwards with newer technology, hoping that processors would evolve into featuring higher clock speeds on a single core, rather than the multi-core design that we use today. Because of this, even the most powerful gaming computers struggle to run the game smoothly, especially whenever there's a lot of physics-based rendering or particle effects on screen. But the game's technical hurdles weren't the only criticisms the game received. Crysis was also criticized for having a shallow story and lackluster combat scenarios. The rushed design of the final levels even pushed some critics into assuming the game was designed purely to sell hardware, a fair conclusion considering some of the ads that released around the time. Still, despite the harsh criticisms, the original Crysis remains one of the most popular entries to the series, and stands as a crowning achievement in graphical evolution that many still argue remains unsurpassed to this day. Before Crysis had even hit store shelves, work had initiated on an expansion pack, aimed to incorporate ideas and concepts that wouldn't be included in the base game's release. The project started off simple enough, with additional vehicles and weapons being tossed in, along with some missions that allowed players to see the other half of the island. But as the project grew in size, Crytek decided to reach out to the newly formed Budapest studio to take over, transforming the expansion into a full standalone release. Using a slightly more optimized version of CryEngine 2, Crytek Budapest spent the course of the next several months building new environments and testing out new ideas, all while addressing many of the concerns players had with the base game. Their first goal was to improve the gameplay variety in each level. Many of the missions in the original game are built to take advantage of one particular approach. The tanks in Onslaught, for example, are the most efficient way to traverse the treacherous valley, as there aren't enough extra rockets or hard cover to take advantage of on foot. So, Team Budapest incorporated a similar approach at first, like a vehicle-centric shooting gallery, but then built additional ammo hubs and clusters of enemies off of the beaten path, giving players a choice in how they approach the gameplay in each level. They also broke up the levels into sections, avoiding making any one particular action sequence dominate the entirety of the level's theme. They next worked to rectify the way aliens were implemented into the combat. The design of the alien-based final levels, and for that matter, the nanosuit, all came in very late in Crysis' development. But with Warhead, the team were already familiar with these fundamental mechanics, and were able to design their levels to take full advantage of them. After only a year of development, the expansion had been completed, and Crytek released their second entry to the series, Crysis Warhead, again exclusively for the PC. Crysis Warhead tells a story that runs parallel to the plot of the original game, only instead of Nomad, players assume the role of Psycho as he pursues a container suspected of containing a nuclear warhead. However, as it was already revealed in the main game, the North Koreans are actually looking to exploit the power of an ancient alien technology hidden beneath the mountains, and Psycho is thrown into a three-way battle between the US, KPA, and emerging alien creatures. There's a few fun moments throughout, but Warhead's narrative is much shorter and gives off a very low-budget feel, reinforced by weirdly scripted and drawn-out cutscenes that were intended to evoke stronger emotions from the player. Warhead also introduces a couple new characters, like Sean O'Neill, a friend of Psycho's that was supposed to be part of Raptor Team but was replaced by Nomad, and Colonel Lee, a vicious new lead antagonist that really loves to use his taser whenever you meet up with him. But even with the new characters and redesigned cutscenes, the story just feels like the B-side to a tape, and while it does shed some light on what Psycho was doing in between his meetups with Nomad, it really doesn't add much to the overarching plot of the series. What it does do, though, is add way more action to the gameplay. This game wastes no time getting players right into the fight. As soon as the player is given control, enemy mortar fire forces them forward into a heavily fortified beachside resort, followed by some intense battles with armored vehicles and KPA checkpoints. All the same weapons return, like the SCAR and FY-71, only with a few small modifications, like a new weapon skin and some balancing tweaks. There's even a few new weapons, like the SMGs that can be dual-wielded, and an experimental plasma cannon that can be used during the game's finale. Warhead also introduces a few new vehicles, including a heavily armored APC, complete with a powerful turret, and a personal hovercraft that can glide over frozen beaches as the player dodges alien scouts bursting through the ice. Warhead also sees the return of the competitive multiplayer mode, only this time the mode operates on a separate client called Crysis Wars. Crysis Wars incorporates all the maps and modes from the original game's multiplayer mode, along with a few new features like weapons, vehicles, maps, and a team deathmatch option that players requested previously. However, just like with the original game, this multiplayer client proved not to fare well in 2008, as many other multiplayer shooter games dominated the scene, keeping the community from ever growing enough to stay active. The servers were eventually shut down with GameSpy, and the mode is only accessible now using community modifications. And it's a real shame, because back when Crysis Warhead released, it was received very well by fans and critics. The new campaign was praised for its more interesting lead character, along with the improvements made to the optimization that made the game run a bit better on higher-end machines. However, despite Crytek Budapest's best efforts, Warhead still suffered from a lot of the same issues as the original. Players began to note that the combat felt stiff, and the alien enemies just weren't any fun to fight against. Others complained that the game was still too demanding, pointing blame at the developers for not optimizing well enough. But most importantly, Warhead was criticized for being short, coming in at roughly 2 hours of playtime from start to finish, earning it a reputation for being a cheap cash grab. The game was nominated for a few awards, but ultimately failed to achieve the same fame as its older brother, and later entries to the series would only further doom Crysis Warhead to obscurity. Meanwhile, back at Crytek's central Frankfurt offices, efforts to update the groundbreaking CryEngine had already commenced, with an increased focus into making the engine function properly with the more complex CPU architecture incorporated into console platforms. For the longest time, the studio has centered their development efforts on high-end PCs, convinced that the hardware available in the average game console would limit their creative freedom. But after reports came in showing a high rate of piracy for their alien fighting adventure, Yurley decided that the only way for Crytek to grow within the industry would be to make room for both PC and console gaming, all while maintaining their established pedigree for high-fidelity graphics. To achieve this reality, the graphical engineers, led by lead R&D specialist Thiago Souza, spent the better part of 2008 overhauling the CryEngine, allowing it to more efficiently process their advanced post-processing effects, and work within the confines of the PS3 and Xbox 360's low memory capacity and multi-core processor design. The lighting was then reworked to incorporate more natural global illumination techniques, eliminating the need to drop in wasteful baked lighting effects throughout each environment. As the team continued to improve the engine's architectural pipeline, they also began to construct a drastically different world than Crytek's typical tropical atmosphere. They decided that for this new entry to the series, players would need to become familiar with a new concrete jungle set on the streets of New York City, complete with the iconic landmarks, skyscrapers, and urban combat. According to an interview between Savat and Game Reactor, this decision was not made to account for console limitations, but it did certainly help. allowing them to focus on high-res textures and effects rather than dense dynamic foliage and long sightlines. On top of this, Crytek also wanted to revamp the core gameplay design to function more comfortably with the console controller's input limitations. This redesign greatly improved the flow of the combat, creating a gameplay experience far removed from its predecessor. Finally, after several years of development, the curtains were drawn back on Crytek's next major project with an E3 reveal in 2010. Yurley took to the stage and revealed an official sequel titled Crysis 2, and provided audiences with a brief glimpse of a battle-torn New York City, devoid of human life and infested with an invading alien force. There was even a brief demonstration of the game in action, showcasing a battle with an alien tripod inside Grand Central Terminal. After E3, the team returned to work, hoping for a holiday release, but inevitably were forced to delay the project into early 2011, a decision that would prove to be even more damaging than they could have ever expected. Only 2 months prior to the game's new release date, a massive leak of the game's beta build made the rounds online, and many justified illegally downloading it as a sort of insurance, afraid that the game would have performance issues again. With the damage already done, Crytek was forced to soldier on, and after a brief multiplayer testing phase, they officially released Crysis 2 for the PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3 in March of 2011. Crysis 2's story begins 3 years after the events on the Lingshan Islands, with the threat of an alien invasion imminent and being compounded by unusual weather patterns and a deadly viral infection spreading through Manhattan. To assist with the evacuation of New York City, the US contracts Cell, a private military company associated with the Crynet program, the very same responsible for the nanosuits. But as Cell's presence grows within the city, it becomes clear that they have their own agenda, and become the new lead human antagonists in the series, with little to no mention of the North Koreans. Meanwhile, Prophet discovers that the alien race, now referred to as the Ceph, have several more dormant hives located underground throughout the world, and he rushes back to Manhattan in hopes of preventing what he believes to be the start of a massive alien invasion force. But by the time he arrives in New York, it's too late. The Ceph have begun to emerge from underground, and the city quickly turns into an apocalyptic war zone, all as a deadly alien virus ravages the civilian population. Players assume the role of a US Marine named Alcatraz, whose unit is sent in to help protect the city. But they're quickly met with Ceph resistance, and Alcatraz is left mortally wounded on the shore. He's then rescued by Prophet, who, after exposure to the virus, decides to sacrifice himself.
Remember me.
And bequeath his life-saving nanosuit to Alcatraz, along with the responsibility to put a stop to the Ceph before it's too late. The campaign takes players through several iconic locations in New York, including Wall Street, Times Square, Grand Central, and even the floating remnants of Central Park, all while Alcatraz wrestles against both the invading alien threat and the lingering memories of Prophet embedded deeply into the suit's membrane. It's, without a doubt, a far more cohesive plotline than what was in the original Crysis, and the removal of familiar characters like Nomad and Helena Rosenthal helped to distance itself further, providing an ultimately unique experience. What's more, Crysis 2 also includes new data logs in its environments, providing additional background info to expand upon the universe's lore. The gameplay experience has also seen a total redesign. While still a first-person shooter built around player choice, Crysis 2 is a lot more linear than its predecessors. Environments are much smaller, and the new urban lanes create clear paths to and from objectives, limiting the potential for exploration and creativity by a large margin. But this more limited scope does at least benefit the combat design. The shooting feels tighter and more consistent, and the controls are better streamlined to improve the flow of the movement. As I mentioned before, changes had to be made to account for the limited input available on a console gamepad, so features like being able to lie prone were removed, and players can only lean when standing at the edge of cover. Additionally, the signature nanosuit has also seen a total overhaul. No longer do players have to cycle through powers in Akama rows, but can now activate some of the less practical abilities automatically when interacting with the environment. Speed mode, for example, is now tied directly to the player's sprint, meaning sprinting through the game will rapidly drain the suit's energy, and likewise, kicking cars or throwing enemies will consume energy for utilizing maximum strength. Therefore, the only two toggleable nanosuit powers are now Shield and Cloak, that are tied to the left and right bumper on a console controller, respectively. By streamlining the nanosuit's abilities, Crysis 2 redirects the player's focus on more engaging combat, with faster pacing and more varied weapons to choose from, each with distinct stats like damage and accuracy displayed with a more detailed nanosuit HUD. Like before, players can zoom in with binocs to tag enemies and analyze objectives, and can also enable a night vision mode, only now with new thermal capabilities. New to Crysis 2 is a nanosuit upgrade system. Much like the weapon customization menu, the nanosuit module screen allows players to activate passive abilities for their suit. These abilities include simple things like better armor, more efficient cloaking, and faster climb speeds, but also include a few new tricks, like the ability to see enemy footprint trails, silent movement, and a powerful air stomp move. Weapons include a redesigned SCAR with varying attachments depending on the variant you find in the environment, shotguns, SMGs, and snipers just like before, and a few new weapons like the M60 LMG, a semi-automatic rifle, and a few futuristic weapons like the K-Volt and X-43 Mike, perfect for melting through the far more varied enemy resistance. Enemies include Cell, that function a lot like the KPA from before, with foot soldiers and powerful armor and air support. And then you have Ceph, who are now much more interesting to fight than their blue ancestors. These Ceph are composed primarily of bipedal infantry units, with the ability to jump high and take cover. There's the Grunts and Stalkers that make up a bulk of the Ceph's military force, and are occasionally reinforced by the tank-like Heavies, the Swarming Ticks, alien air support like dropships and gunships, and the devastating Tripod Pingers, a sort of evolution of the Scouts that seems ripped straight from War of the Worlds. Just like with the story, the gameplay feels more properly realized than the past two games, with smart controls, more thoughtful level design, and better enemy variety. But the lack of player freedom feels like a disservice to the series' core values, and Crysis 2's campaign ends up feeling like a roller coaster of scripted action set pieces and narrative plot threads that never lets you off until you reach the credits. As with most games in the early 2010s, Crysis 2 decided that its multiplayer would need to borrow heavily from Infinity Ward's hugely popular Call of Duty series. The large 32-player power struggles are replaced with more basic team deathmatch skirmishes, built around weapon and nanosuit loadouts. All the improved combat controls can be found here, providing a much more fast-paced shooter experience, but many found the multiplayer to be a step back, claiming that it was dumbed down to appeal to the average console gamer. But despite this, Crysis 2 was met with mostly positive reviews. It was praised for its intuitive control scheme, its bold new city environments, and its beautiful visual design. However, some did complain about the linearity of the levels, and the story not being quite as memorable as other alien invasion stories offered in games like Half-Life. On top of that, PC players felt betrayed by Crytek, who had seemingly sold out to the mainstream console market. Complaints from PC gamers included less graphic options in the menus, along with smaller environments and less of a sandbox feel to the gameplay. These criticisms echoed even louder due to widespread illegal distribution of the game online, making it the most pirated PC game of 2011. When the dust had settled, Crysis 2 greatly underperformed. Critics liked the game, but the sales numbers ended up being lower than the first Crysis. And while Crytek acknowledged these concerns, they had already at this point turned their focus towards future projects. After Crysis 2, the focus for the developers at Crytek began to shift rapidly. CryEngine 3 provided a solid foothold into multi-platform game design, and enabled the expansive network of studios to generate even more titles, including a sequel to Chaos Studios' Homefront, and an upcoming Xbox exclusive called Rise: Son of Rome. But at the same time, these projects greatly strained Crytek's resources, and pulled key staff away from the Crysis IP, leaving the planned fourth entry to a skeleton crew of roughly 100 individuals. Still, despite the lack of manpower and a much lower budget, the development team remained confident that they could deliver the most ambitious Crysis experience to date. Like before, Crytek started by addressing common complaints, chief among them being the limitations of the New York City setting. But instead of simply bringing the game back to an island, Crytek came up with a creative solution: a return to New York City, but this time consumed by a lush jungle environment. With this core concept in place, the development was accelerated. They tweaked the CryEngine to allow for more advanced visual effects, but many of the assets like weapon models and general gameplay mechanics were carried over directly, greatly shaving down the development cost. This also allowed more time for the developers to improve the flow of the gameplay, combining the smooth gunplay from Crysis 2 with the more open-ended level design of Crysis 1. As they were building the bigger environments, Crytek eventually landed on the idea of turning the player into a hunter, armed with a powerful bow and arrow and stalking enemies through fields of tall grass. Assess, adapt, attack. These were the core tenets that the development team worked around, encouraging hit-and-run tactics. Crytek also saw potential in improving the game's narrative, and reintroduced who they felt were the series' strongest assets to help make the most epic narrative in the series so far. Then, after only 2 years of development, Crytek released the final entry to the Crysis trilogy, Crysis 3. Crysis 3 takes place 24 years after the previous game, with the Ceph invasion seemingly halted, and Cell working around the clock to harness leftover alien technology to control the remains of the world. Meanwhile, Prophet, whose consciousness eventually absorbed Alcatraz's via the nanosuit, travels with his old colleague Psycho to help put a stop to the aliens once and for all. But before they're able to do so, Cell captures them both, and attempts to painfully strip them of their alien-infused nanosuits. The player takes control of Prophet, and is given control after he's broken from Cell's containment by a nanosuit-free Psycho. But as the two reach the doors into a large, walled-off structure, it becomes clear what has happened. Cell, in an attempt to contain the remaining Ceph stragglers, have built a gigantic biodome around the ruins of New York City, transforming it into a lush jungle monitored by powerful automatic turrets located along the central support beams. This is where the adventure truly begins, as Prophet and Psycho work together with a local resistance group to disrupt Cell operations. But as the story progresses, it becomes clear that the final Ceph invasion is still very much in the works, and another three-way conflict for the fate of the world ensues. Crysis 3's plot is a clever combination of aspects introduced in Crysis 2 and the elements that the series started with back in 2007. Characters are now more fleshed out, with several dramatic moments between Psycho and Prophet expanding on themes of human versus technology. And while it's certainly one of the shorter entries in the series, it does at least come full circle at the end, wrapping up the trilogy with a somewhat satisfying conclusion. As far as the gameplay is concerned, Crysis 3 shares a lot of similarities to the previous game. The feel of the movement is mostly identical, and many elements like the 2-weapon limit, the customization menus, and combat controls remain intact. However, Crysis 3 does introduce a few nice changes. First off, level environments are much larger and more open-ended, allowing players to approach objectives with a bit more freedom. It's still not quite as large as the environments in the first Crysis, but the opportunity to bypass enemies with stealth is an actual realistic option again. What's more, Crysis 3 also toys with the idea of player creativity, thanks to the inclusion of the new Predator Bow. This weapon allows players to silently dispatch enemies while remaining completely cloaked, with various jaw strengths to choose between to balance the power versus speed. But the bow can also be equipped with special arrow tips, including impact explosives, or my favorite, the electric bolts, that can fry enemies waiting in pools of water. In addition to the Predator Bow, players can also equip many of the same firearms from Crysis 2, like the Scar, the Grendel, K-Volt, and Feline, along with the Typhoon that sports an impressive 30,000 rounds per minute. Additionally, thanks to the nanosuit's acquired alien DNA, players can now equip weird new alien-specific weapons that can have a devastating impact against enemy resistance. The enemies themselves have also seen a few tweaks. Cell, for the most part, appear the same as before, though their AI is enhanced a bit to allow for more realistic search scripts to account for the increased focus on stealth. Cell also makes use of a few new defensive weapons in the environment, including high-tech landmines and automatic turrets, both of which can be remotely hacked and churned against the enemy. The Ceph have similarly returned, with a lot of the same variants as before, though there's a few new species mixed in, including the flamethrower-equipped Ceph Scorchers, the Mastermind that can use telekinesis to attack the player, and most powerful of all, the Alpha Ceph, the leader of the Ceph's Earthbound invasion force. With new enemies, more open-ended level designs, and the more powerful weapons, Crysis 3 provides an experience worthy of the Crysis name, assisted further by a remarkable visual presentation that is still arguably one of the best-looking games out there. But it's also one of the shortest campaigns in the series, and its unique setting never feels properly explored. Crysis 3 also includes with it another take on competitive multiplayer, complete with the standard team deathmatch modes and several maps designed to take full advantage of the nanosuit's capabilities. But one of the best new additions to the multiplayer is the Hunter mode. In Hunter mode, 2 players are chosen to become the Hunters, equipped only with a Predator Bow and the ability to remain cloaked indefinitely. If a hunter kills one of the many survivors, those survivors then respawn on the Hunter team, slowly tipping the scales until there's no survivors remaining. Crysis 3 even sees the return of vehicles in its multiplayer, with players able to pilot the tripod pingers to devastate their opponents. But again, despite its somewhat returning to its roots, Crysis 3's multiplayer just wasn't as popular as other shooters released around the same time, and it quickly lost its main audience, with only a few players left playing it today. Crysis 3 as a whole was met with a lukewarm reception. Industry professionals praised the gorgeous visual design, especially on the PC, and still use it as a benchmark to this day. but the campaign was knocked for being too short, and many called Crytek out for playing it too safe with its story and gameplay mechanics. Sure, level environments were bigger, and the new bow and arrow was a nice touch, but Crysis 3 failed to live up to the type of open-ended gameplay design that fans wanted. In fact, most levels still retained a heavy sense of linearity to them, and the enemy AI proved to be too easy to outsmart, making the game a repetitive and ultimately forgettable experience. With lower reviews and disappointing sales numbers, Crysis 3 proved to be the final nail in the coffin for this once great series. And with the story coming to an ultimate conclusion, Crytek made the decision to close the books on the series for good, a decision that would soon be followed by years of misfortune for the company. As the video game industry prepped for a transition to next-gen consoles, Crytek struggled immensely. Development costs mounted substantially, and each title released under the Crytek name failed to meet sales targets. By 2014, many reports started surfacing revealing that Crytek employees were not being paid on time, an issue that inevitably resulted in its founder, Savat Yurli, stepping down and being replaced by his two brothers. To address the high development costs, Crytek stepped away from retail game development and focused instead on a new free-to-play distribution model, with significant support being attributed to their multiplayer-only shooter Warface. Crytek was then forced to shut down several of their worldwide studios, including offices in Hungary, Bulgaria, South Korea, and in China. They were even forced to sell the rights to the Homefront series along with the UK studio working on it, a move that greatly impacted that game's development cycle. However, one of their newer studios, Crytek USA, remained operable, and the studio proceeded with work on a new cooperative shooter game based in the 19th century. After the Crytek restructuring in 2014, many members of this particular studio parted ways, leaving the game in a state of uncertainty. But by 2017, news of the game had resurfaced, and Hunt Showdown would go on to release as a competitive multiplayer experience in 2019, built using an updated version of the CryEngine, far surpassing the visual and audio capabilities offered in Crytek's previous games. Aside from some VR titles, Hunt Showdown was the first major title to release under the Crytek banner since the near collapse of the studio in 2014, and it received some generally positive reception, with many praising the game for its creative gameplay and unique setting. Crytek had finally returned, at least to some degree, though hope regarding the future of the Crysis series remained low. But then, something unexpected happened. During a reveal of Crytek's updated CryEngine technology, Crytek showed off a familiar tropical scene, accompanied by a distinct musical score from the original Crysis. At first, many wrote it off as just a simple throwback to Crytek's origins, but others saw it as something else, a potential teaser of what was to come. Then, in April of 2020, the Crysis YouTube channel dropped an official teaser for Crysis Remastered, showing Nomad turning to face the camera in his iconic nanosuit. This remaster is set to release for the PC, Xbox One, PS4, and surprisingly, the Nintendo Switch, and will likely take full advantage of Crytek's latest engine, while also challenging an entire new generation to see if their computer hardware is up to the task. For now, details are being held tight to the chest, but if the Xbox 360 and PS3 ports of the original Crysis are any indication, it's possible that this remaster will play a bit differently from the 2007 classic, with a more intuitive control scheme and more advanced lighting effects. Though I guess we'll just have to wait and see if they manage to retain the revolutionary physics that turned heads over a decade ago. No release date has been announced so far, but chances are the game will release on August 7, 2020, the same day that Raptor Team first encountered the Ceph on the Lingshan Islands. And I'll be sure to provide plenty of coverage of the game when that happens, including a full review and in-depth direct comparison, so be sure to stay tuned in the coming months for more info. Crysis, despite its short lifetime within the whole of the gaming industry, has made a major name for itself, thanks to its revolutionary graphics, open-ended shooter mechanics, and its cinematic alien invasion storyline. With only 3 main entries and a standalone expansion, this sci-fi saga is probably unfamiliar to many young gamers, but its impact can still be found throughout the industry. Crysis represented the launch of a new era for PC gaming, with more cinematic high-quality experiences becoming the new norm, and it also pushed developers to rethink how they approached their graphical presentation. Before other developers could even catch up though, Crytek took several more steps forward, and retrofitted their powerful CryEngine to provide even more impressive visuals within the confines of the limited tech afforded by 7th generation game consoles. It was an incredible undertaking, and despite the somewhat underwhelming gameplay scope, still improved greatly on the formula with tighter controls and a better written narrative. But the jump to the console platform also hurt the trust Crytek had established with its PC fanbase, with many complaining that Crysis had become too casual and wasn't as ambitious as before. And while the small team of developers behind Crysis 3 tried their best to address these concerns, the damage was already done, and the Crysis IP was left to gather dust throughout the majority of the 8th gen consoles. But even after all these years, Crysis is still recognized as one of the most technologically impressive video games of all time, and Crytek, having nearly collapsed under itself in 2014, is primed for a potential comeback, with a remaster of an experience that had us all asking, can it run Crysis? But what do you guys think? Which Crysis game was your favorite? And where do you think Crytek should take the series next? Let me know in the comments section. Now, I want to give a special shout out to my patrons for helping to make this documentary possible, including Chad Troutwine, No Great Mystery, Kung Fu Hot Dog, Uriel Tomsoff, and B-Man. Your support is greatly appreciated. If you'd like to join this growing list of supporters, please check out the link listed below, where you can get early access to new documentaries, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive Discord access, and personalized shoutouts, all while helping me to improve the quality of these projects. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.